America's housing market used to be explicitly segregated based on race. Has class-based discrimination replaced that? And if so, what should we do about it? Richard Kahlenberg is a non-resident scholar at Georgetown University, a senior fellow at the Progressive Policy Institute, and he's the author of the new book, Excluded: How Snob Zoning, NIMBYism, and Class Bias Build the Walls We Don't See. In this episode, we talk about Richard's new book and discuss how zoning was built to enforce class-based discrimination. We talk about the relationship between education inequality and zoning restrictions, and the political path forward to building more housing. As always, if you support the podcast, then please like and subscribe, leave a nice comment. All of those things are helpful. And if you really want to support us, you can join our Patreon at patreon.com/neoliberalpodcast. You can also support the podcast by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org/become a member and get involved in all the great things that the Center for New Liberalism is doing around housing and many other issues. Thank you so much for your support, everyone, and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me this episode is Richard Kahlenberg. Richard, welcome to the show.
Oh, well, thanks so much for having me, Jeremiah.
So it's interesting when I, think about your work that I've read before. A lot of what I've associated with you in the past is educational stuff. And I know that you've done a lot of work in the past around education and access to good education for every American. And I'm curious what led you into, writing a book about housing. Do you see these two issues as linked, or how did you get interested in this in the first place?
Well, absolutely. Housing policy is education policy, particularly the subject of my book. The zoning laws that decide who gets to live where in America has a huge impact on educational opportunity because in large measure, it shapes where kids get to go to school. So 71% of students attend neighborhood public schools. And as a result, when you have housing policies and exclusionary zoning policies that keep people of modest means, out of certain neighborhoods, that means they're shut out of those strong public schools. And that has a huge impact on educational opportunities. So I guess maybe I'm a late learner or something, but after really decades of working on policies to use public school choice to try to promote equal opportunity, I've come to the conclusion that at least as a parallel strategy, it's crucial to deal with exclusionary housing policies.
It's interesting reading in the book, Excluded. You do a lot of interviews with particular people, kind of case studies of individuals that will then let you talk about kind of the wider problem. And that's a pretty common thing to do in this kind of book, right? But one of the themes that comes up over and over again is not just, well, I want to live in a bigger house because it's bigger, not just I want to live in a nicer neighborhood just because it's nicer, but because of my kids. These are parents who are worried specifically about their kids and whether or not the kids are going to be growing up in the wrong kind of neighborhood with the wrong kind of influences, whether or not the kids are going to be going to the right kind of school. And maybe that's just, I'm part of the DC policy wonk crowd and we're all in our 20s and 30s and none of us have kids yet, it seems like. But that's something that I think doesn't get talked about as much in these housing debates as maybe it should.
I think that's right. So obviously, the zoning laws that limit the supply of housing have a huge impact on home prices, and that's kind of the leading way in which people think about the need for reform. They look at rents and they see they're unaffordable, and so it's natural to me that would be the first instinct.
Yeah, and that's not wrong, right? It's not wrong to be like, well, the reason housing price this is bad is because rent is so high. But you're saying it's just not the only reason.
Exactly. No, I'm 100% on board with the idea that it's deeply problematic when we limit the supply of housing and artificially increase prices. But I'm saying in addition to that, there's a huge issue of really civil rights and equal educational opportunity that should also be part of this housing discussion. And I talked to a lot of low-wage single mothers who are desperate to have a better opportunity for their kids. These are people whose values are deeply American values. They want to climb the economic ladder. They want their kids to have a better life than they've had. And so it's deeply important for them that their children be able to go to strong schools where they're going to be surrounded by other students who are going to be good influences and have, just as kind of a very basic threshold matter, a place to go to school that's safe. I mean, a lot of upper middle class people tend to look at test scores, and they tend to look at the curriculum and all sorts of important things in schools. But as a basic matter, a lot of people are just fearful that schools are not safe in their neighborhood, and that their kids aren't able to play outside. I talked to one mother, Chiara Cornelius, who would drive her kids to their grandmother's house a couple blocks away because to walk would not have been safe. And so she wanted better for her kids. One of her children was a straight A student. She knew he was gifted. She wanted him to get a great education. And yet the neighborhoods that had strong public schools also tended to have policies in place that required oftentimes ban apartment buildings, ban multifamily housing of any kind, sometimes impose requirements that if there is multi-family housing, that use expensive siding. So she was being kept out, not just by the marketplace, but by government zoning are defeating equal educational opportunity in America.
I think that's really the key point, is that, the same neighborhoods that people look at and they think I could thrive there, my children would thrive there, that's where the great schools are. Those are the same neighborhoods that are obviously, hard to build in. They try to ban apartment dwellings. They try to basically make it difficult to build low-income housing. And as a result, these are very expensive neighborhoods that it is almost impossible to move into if you're not already upper class or upper middle class. Can you talk a second? And we're kind of going down this rabbit hole on education, but I think it's a fascinating rabbit hole that maybe, the YIMBY movement doesn't pay attention to enough. One of the things that people will say in response to this about, good schools is that, well, really schools are just a function of who lives in an area. It's not that the schools in Massachusetts or certain areas of Connecticut are just good because they're good. But, if you get a bunch of rich people who all have PhDs, well, obviously the school that their kids are going to go to is going to end up being a great school because those are all really smart kids who grew up with parents that care about education. And how does that kind of mix in with the idea that you can move to a school district and it will benefit your kids?
Well, there's some truth, obviously, to the fact that children who are raised in families that have all sorts of advantages are, on average, going to do better academically. But there is powerful research from Raj Chetty at Harvard and many other studies, which finds that economically disadvantaged students, if given the right environment, can do amazing things. and that students who are from low-income families will have a chance to go to higher opportunity neighborhoods where many of the classmates in the school are going to be more economically advantaged. We'll do quite a bit better. There's one interesting study in Montgomery County, Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C., which looked at two strategies for increasing educational opportunities for low-income students. One was to provide $2,000 extra per pupil in the higher poverty schools, the schools where more children were poor. And that had some positive effect. But there was a parallel strategy involving housing that turned out to matter a whole lot more. And through the policy known as inclusionary zoning, a builder set aside a certain number of units of market rate housing, certain number of units for those who are less economically advantaged. And so students in those schools, the schools that had higher income peers, but were actually spending $2,000 less per pupil than the poorer part of the county, did far better over time. They cut the math gap with the middle class kids in half, cut the reading gap by a third. And so who you go to school with matters a lot. Stronger teachers tend to be attracted to economically mixed schools as opposed to high poverty schools. And the students have positive peer influences. They're around kids who just expect to go on to college, don't think about it, and on average, more likely to be academically engaged. And they're also part of a school where the parents, on average, because they're more privileged, are much more likely to volunteer in class, be members of the PTA, to donate to the school. So all those things have a snowball effect and mean that low-income students who have a chance to go to more economically advantaged schools nationally are between 1 and 2 years ahead academically of low-income students who are in high-poverty schools.
One of the focuses of the book, at least early in the book, is an important one that talks about kind of the difference between racial discrimination in housing and class-based discrimination. And that's something I'd love to dive into a little bit. But before we kind of get explicitly kind of comparing those two things as they exist today, maybe we could talk a little bit about the history. How did kind of the explicit segregation of housing that used to exist in America turn into our current system, which is more based around restrictive zoning and kind of making it really difficult for poor people to move in? How did that historical process play out?
Great question. And, in the early 20th century, when zoning policies first began to be put into place in different communities, there was the highly reasonable idea that you'd want to have industry and factories separate from residential areas. And that was a matter of public health and safety. Made a lot of sense. But soon after those laws were put in place, there was a more nefarious turn. And throughout many communities in the United States, from Baltimore to Louisville, you saw racial zoning. So by law, if you were Black, you could not purchase homes in neighborhoods that were predominantly white. And the same logic was applied, in a twisted way. White politicians said it will be better for the health and safety of white people to be separate from Black people, and that Black people should be quarantined, separate and apart from white people. Well, that was even too much for the U.S. Supreme Court. And in 1917, in a case called Buchanan versus Worley, the U.S. Supreme Court said that's a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. You can't have laws that separate zoning or use zoning to separate families by race. But very quickly thereafter, communities figured out that they could use economic zoning, exclusionary zoning, the policies that are pervasive today, to accomplish much the same result. Because of discrimination, Black people were and are disproportionately disadvantaged by economic status. And so a requirement that everyone's welcome in this neighborhood so long as they can afford a single family home. And sometimes we'll put in the additional requirement that the home has to sit on a plot that's quarter acre or half an acre. That effectively excluded most Black families and continues to have a racially discriminatory effect to this day. But in essence, because of that Supreme Court decision, racial zoning morphed into economic zoning, and it took off some of the crude edge of racial discrimination. And so today we have pervasive class discrimination against those who are less fortunate economically, where entire communities are set off or separate and apart from other communities based on economic status. And I've been astounded to hear the defense of these policies. Just very recently in The Atlantic, Rehan Salam, president of the Manhattan Institute, and is, by the way, a good YIMBY, who I agree with on a lot of issues, said that, in essence, we really shouldn't raise this issue of class discrimination because it's endemic. It's not something that's going to change. He said that today it's perfectly rational for wealthy people to build walls around their communities because people of lower economic status are less likely to pay as much in property taxes, and therefore their kids will use the public schools, but they won't pay their way. And so you have a situation like in Scarsdale, New York, a wealthy suburb, where they have a community just a couple miles away, 7 miles away, called Portchester, where it's heavily Hispanic and low income. And the people from Portchester come over to Scarsdale to mow the lawns and to take care of the kids in Scarsdale. But there are explicit policies in place that come close to banning all multifamily housing to make sure that low-income families won't actually live in Scarsdale. And they can come in for the day, do the work, but then they need to leave. And to my mind, it's not as bad as racial discrimination, but it's pretty close. And it ought to be disturbing to us.
Is that silent commentator you were talking about? Is that Rehan Salam by any chance?
Yes, Rehan Salam was the one who was defending this type of exclusionary policy, and he said the other thing is he cited the idea that there are polls which suggest that many people think that low income and working class families are going to be essentially bad neighbors. They're going to be louder, more likely to engage in illegal dumping, more likely to commit crimes. And once again, he didn't cite any evidence to begin with that these things were true. Most of the research suggests crime is committed by a tiny number of individuals in a high poverty community. It's not that low income people, like the low wage mothers I interviewed, are going to engage in. And yet, even if one could statistically say, here's this link between income and crime, or income and noise, and income or illegal dumping, with respect to race, we long ago said that robs the dignity of individuals to assume that because someone is a member of a certain race, they're more likely to act a certain way. And the same principle holds true for income. And yet, when I've written articles for the New York Times and elsewhere about the need to reduce class-based discrimination in zoning, the comments are just astounding. People will write in, using their actual names and say, you don't understand. Poor people make for unpleasant neighbors. I had one guy who said that the dogs of poor people bark louder. I mean, it's astonishing what people will come up with.
I may be more cynical than you when it comes to Rehan. I do not think he actually cares about the issue. I think he views this as a convenient way to kind of politically, hit his opponents with a stick. But that's me being cynical about the guy who runs the Manhattan Institute. But, I think it's interesting because certainly there is a statistical correlation between, areas that have poverty and individuals who are in poverty and like the crime rate, for instance, or, a neighborhood that is aesthetically not very nice to be in, or that has dangerous streets or whatever the case may be. But when I think about that, I think about like concentrated poverty, that things are dangerous when there is an area that is 95% impoverished, as opposed to, if your country is 80% middle class and 20% impoverished, just to throw some numbers out there, and that's like 80-20 everywhere, that you're not actually going to have very many dangerous areas, as opposed to if you would put all 20% of the poor people, just shove them all in the same neighborhood, what I guess we call the ghetto. That's where you actually get kind of the big societal problems coming from is the concentration of poverty.
Absolutely. The research is very clear on that question. Concentrations of poverty do have a negative effect. They have a negative effect in schooling. They have a negative effect on crime. But I'm thinking of people like Chiara Cornelius, who is low income. She works hard at her job, but doesn't make a lot of money. And she is concerned about was concerned about the crime, that she was in the neighborhood of concentrated poverty in Columbus, Ohio, in which she lived. But she was trying to escape that and was not herself going to bring any troubles at all. And so I think we have to view this through the lens of aspiring people who happen to have less money, but have the same sort of values that most Americans have, law-abiding, and want better for their kids.
When I think about like a class-based version of this, that we should kind of explicitly make the class argument that this is something rich NIMBY homeowners are doing for the most part, and they're doing it in order to protect their property values, and this hurts working class people. There's kind of two things that I think about. Number one, the moral case, which you've kind of been talking about. Is this the morally correct thing to do? Is it the right ethical framework, I guess, to kind of view this through a class-based lens of income-based discrimination, that kind of thing? But then I also think on a second level, is this the right political strategy? Is this actually going to work? So how would you think about those two ideas in tandem? Like, do you think this is a winning political strategy, or is this the kind of thing that might actually backfire on the housing movement?
Well, Rehan Salam's argument is that it'll backfire if you accuse people of being snobs. And that isn't my point. My point isn't, there are a lot of good people in upper middle class neighborhoods. I think they move there because they know the schools are strong, and I don't think they give a whole lot of thought to exclusionary zoning policies. But if one makes the moral argument that this is not a victimless crime, there are people whose lives are hurt, whose housing is made more expensive, whose kids are not going to have opportunity in life, that will sway some people in those exclusive suburbs. But the much bigger political argument is that the number of people in exclusive communities are far outnumbered by everyone else on the outside. And this is not just theory. We've seen in states where exclusionary zoning has been reduced that it was a coalition of oftentimes working class people in places like California and Oregon who came together across party lines to get reform. And so you had in California the division over who would support an effort to end exclusive single-family zoning statewide and allow, in essence, up to fourplexes on what had been a plot of land for single-family. That passed not because exclusive liberal suburbs went along. It passed because Republican legislators who represent white working class communities, oftentimes rural, allied with Black and Hispanic legislators in urban areas who are Democrats. And they all felt excluded for different reasons, sometimes because of race, sometimes because of class, sometimes because of less education. But the common feeling was these exclusive suburbs are treating us with disdain and thwarting opportunity, and this ought to change. And so it's not just kind of a political theory that working class people across racial lines could get together. It's the reality in these states that has happened. The State Rural Urban Coalition came together in Oregon as well. So I think there's a lot of potential by emphasizing the way in which class discrimination hurts people across racial lines.
What's really interesting about that pattern is that it is not the same pattern that's playing out in national politics. In national politics, working class white people are very much going for, the Republican Party more than they ever have, and are going for Trump specifically. And Democrats are making their gains among educated, white professionals, white college graduates. And certainly the Democrats still have their working class base in terms of people of color. But, this coalition of kind of working class people of different colors, different ethnic backgrounds is not the trend that we see in national politics. And partially, that's the reason I'm very skeptical of someone like Reihan Salam, whose whole existence to me, again, I'm a very cynical guy and so I look at him and I see him soft walking the Trumpist position, which is, Trump talks about how Democrats want to destroy your suburbs. And Reihan seems he's a little smarter about it. He couches it in nicer language, but he's essentially trying to make the same point. But when the NIMBY movement has succeeded, it's kind of at crosswinds with the national environment in terms of the way that things seem to be sorting out with polarization.
That's absolutely right. I mean, to my mind, the tragedy of American politics the last 50 or 60 years has been that liberal dream of a multiracial working class coalition of the type that Bobby Kennedy put together in 1968, that has been destroyed at the national level.
Hey, we've got Bobby Kennedy Jr. Isn't he just as good? I hear he's got some great policies.
Talk about tragedies. I'm a huge fan of the Kennedy family, and I feel terrible for them that this guy is out there spouting conspiracy.
Sorry, I'm getting us off base a little bit, but I had to throw it in there. So
yes. No, important to distinguish Robert Kennedy Sr. Talking about, and but the coalition, the Bobby Kennedy coalition, pops up every once in a while. So you see it in education, for example, in the 1990s when race-based affirmative action was discontinued at the state level in Texas. You had a coalition of working class white legislators representing working class white Republicans ally with Black and Hispanic Democratic legislators to pass what they call the top 10% plan, where, irrespective of your SAT scores, you automatically are admitted to UT Austin. And so you had working class people, communities who had never sent someone to UT Austin before, suddenly having the chance to do that. So there are glimpses of this coalition around self-interest that emerge. Some people argue that Democrats should stay away from zoning reform, in part because it does negatively impact some highly educated white liberal communities. So Scarsdale, I mentioned earlier, gave 75% of its votes to Joe Biden. And I hope Scarsdale residents continue to vote for Democrats. But one has to say, at what cost are the Democrats continuing this reliance on upper middle class votes? If it turns out that the Democrats aren't willing to deal with some of the fundamental issues around housing that impact so many people, because they're worried about offending what is quickly becoming the new Democratic base of upper middle class, highly educated white people, then that raises bigger questions about what the Democrats, what sort of coalition the Democrats should be relying on.
And that's obviously a much broader conversation. But I'm going to narrow us back down for a second, because there's a couple points in the book that I found really interesting and I wanted to ask you about. And this is the part of the podcast where I nitpick anything that maybe I slightly disagree with. And I want to let the listeners know, this is a good book overall. You should definitely check this out if you care about housing policy. But, it would be a boring interview if I just agree with you 100% of the time, if I'm just a cheerleader. So I wanted to call out a few things that I just, I had some questions about. So one of the things that's mentioned many times throughout the book, and it's not a focus that you focus on really intensely, but it is mentioned many times, is inclusionary zoning. And this is where, a typical inclusionary zoning program would be something like, well, when you build a new building, you have to make sure that you set aside 15% or 20% of the units to be affordable at some definition of affordable, so that low or moderate income people can live in those units. And inclusionary zoning has become more popular over time, especially in large progressive cities. And the book speaks, kind of promisingly about this. This might be a really interesting, innovative way to address things. But I tend to be very skeptical of inclusionary zoning. I think there's some research that shows that it can backfire, especially when it's designed badly, as a lot of policies in our giant cities are designed pretty badly. That it can restrict the supply of housing because, if your inclusionary zoning is too strict or requires too much affordability, then people just won't bother to build large buildings anymore. How do you think about inclusionary zoning? Are you optimistic about it? And if you are, what's the case for why this is a good thing?
Oh, I share your concern. Inclusionary zoning can be used by essentially, highly educated liberal elites as a way of sounding progressive, but then stopping all building. If the requirements are too onerous, then nothing gets built, which is makes some highly educated liberals feel good because they're for inclusionary zoning in theory.
It's very funny, by the way, that people used to complain that, oh, well, this, we can't build new housing because that'll bring poor people into our neighborhoods. Now they complain we can't build this new housing project because it doesn't have enough inclusionary zoning. It doesn't have enough affordable units. And it seems like the net effect either way is just that we're not building anything. But
yeah, absolutely. So inclusionary zoning can be misused as yet another NIMBY tool to stop housing altogether. That's not the type of inclusionary zoning I support. I do think there are enough examples of where housing was built with inclusionary requirements, and it's built because the builder gets something out of it. As you know, many of these policies are designed so that you receive a density bonus. You can build more housing, make more of a profit on a particular area of land if you agree to some of the units being inclusionary. And in those instances, I think that can broaden opportunity for low-income people. And that's the type of inclusionary zoning that I'm supportive of. So I think you have to hit the sweet spot where inclusionary zoning is attractive, built in a way that's attractive enough so that housing actually is built and does not become so onerous that it becomes a tool for stopping development altogether.
Another thing that the book mentions but doesn't explore very much is the idea of zoning itself as an impediment to building more housing versus kind of the everything else mixture, whether it's parking requirements or setback requirements or, environmental review processes or, just the fact that you have to go through 10 rounds of community input hearings. There's kind of all these different tools that can be used by bad faith actors to just make sure that nothing gets built and the neighborhood never changes. How do you think about, is zoning really enough? Like, obviously we have to fix single family zoning and a lot of this stuff as a starting point. But if we did that, would people just find other ways to try to figure out how to block housing? Like, what's the tool here to make sure they don't just say, well, okay, zoning is gone, but now you need 5 parking spaces for each apartment?
Totally legitimate concern. And sorry, I keep agreeing with you on these areas where we're supposed to be disagreeing.
I love when people agree with me. Everyone should agree with me all the time, Richard.
But I take your point. I mean, zoning is one piece of the puzzle here, but there are a variety of ways in which NIMBYs can stop development. I mean, there was one thing I mentioned in the book where there was a Connecticut community that was requiring 3 off-street parking spaces for a single apartment. Now, that's clearly designed to stop development, make it unaffordable for a builder to move forward on that project. And so explicit inclusionary zoning laws are one piece of a larger set of policies that need to be addressed, including some environmental policies that are weaponized, well-intended initially, but are weaponized today to stop development. So I propose an Economic Fair Housing Act, which would go after all of these things in a community. So if a community had a set of policies that were discriminatory against low-income people, working class people, essentially we're trying to keep that out of a community. And it could be single family zoning, it could be parking requirements, it could be, a homeowners association saying that multifamily housing has to have this, these expensive features to it, like the brick siding. The Economic Fair Housing Act would address all those issues by saying that the burden shifts to the municipality to show that those exclusionary policies are necessary to achieve, a certain set of legitimate goals. And so the burden would shift to the municipality to justify why their exclusionary policies are necessary to achieve a legitimate goal. So there's an analogous, this draws on civil rights law, where policies that discriminate in effect rather than necessarily purposefully need to be justified in order to stand. And so that would be the policy nationally, that judges would adjudicate on whether policies that are challenged are necessary to achieve legitimate goals. And a lot of times, it's going to be very hard to justify. So let's say a community has a half-acre requirement for single-family homes. Now, they'll likely bring up some sort of environmental argument or some aesthetic argument, but the idea that these are necessary and that you can't accomplish your goals through less restricted means is going to be very, very tough for the municipality to prove. And so my point is, you're absolutely right. There are a variety of techniques that are used to exclude people. And I think the Economic Fair Housing Act would go after all of them in one fell swoop.
All right. So since we're talking about a potential bill that would have to make its way through Congress, I think it's time to talk about the political obstacles. And this is something that I actually really appreciate about the book, because, like, just to be real for a second, I read a lot of books on housing, and to some extent, it's hard to learn anything new when you're on like your 12th book about housing, right? There's a lot of points that get reiterated in a lot of different books, but your book in particular has a focus that many books do not have explicitly on the politics of housing. And there's a lot of books that focus more on just like, here's a bunch of studies and here's like a mountain of evidence about why we should build more housing. And I appreciate those books, but I do think it's, at this point, we've got the mountain of evidence. We really need to switch to talking about the politics of it all. And your book does that. So can you talk about what you think are the main political obstacles? And there's different theories about what those obstacles are going to be. But what do you think are those obstacles? What do you think are the most serious things standing in the way of really building a successful movement to build more housing in America and make housing more affordable?
Well, let me first agree with you that for decades, there's been almost a consensus among researchers and policy folks that exclusionary zoning, existing artificial caps on the supply of housing are unjustified, do all sorts of damage to the environment, to housing prices. But then there's been this political consensus that there's nothing you can do about it. And so the primary obstacles have been NIMBY homeowners who have a lot of say at the local level in American politics, because homeowners see a threat to their property values if there's any change. They're just not sure what the effect will be. And so they're risk averse and will tend to show up at zoning meetings and oppose any changes.
And this is an active debate as to why these people are doing this, because we know they show up. We know that, NIMBYs and older people and retirees and homeowners are all like wildly overrepresented at these community meetings. The community meetings do not actually represent the community. They represent a very narrow slice of the community. But there's different theories about why they show up. One theory is that, well, they're just concerned about their property values. This is like rational economic behavior. Another theory is that, they're motivated by racism, which certainly in American history has happened a lot. Sometimes people just think, oh, well, really, they're just concerned about like very boring stuff like parking and traffic and stuff like that. Do you lean towards any one of these theories, or how do you interpret that phenomenon?
Well, I think there's all of the above. and I would add classism is as important as racism today. I mean, there are upper middle class Black communities that exclude lower income Black people. There are upper middle class white communities that exclude lower income white people. So it's racism is in there, but so is classism, so is self-interest, and so is aversion to change. So I think all of those things are contributing to the problem. I guess I'm suggesting I don't lean towards one of those theories over the other. I think many of them are at play. But what communities like, I mean, I look to the examples of places that have achieved reform for guidance on how to overcome those obstacles. And Minneapolis is a really interesting case, in part because they recognize that one person's concern about property values is another person's housing affordability crisis. That is to say, when property values are artificially inflated by government zoning laws, that has a negative impact on younger people, on people of modest means who are trying to get into the housing market. And so they were able to draw upon those coalitions for change. But they also tried to change who shows up at the meetings and bring people who hadn't ever been to meetings about reform of land use rules, to make sure that their voices were heard. And I think that's important, because it is a small group of incumbent homeowners who have in the past had disproportionate power. But I think there are all sorts of interesting political coalitions that can come together. This is one of those rare issues where liberals and conservatives can potentially come to the same policy conclusion from very, very different angles. And so conservatives who believe in property rights do not want the government telling them what to do with their land. Conservatives who believe in economic efficiency and don't like that our economic productivity is hurt when people can't afford to move to regions of the country which are highly productive, where they could earn larger wages. Those conservative ideas about liberty can be married with more traditional liberal ideas about equality, that it's wrong to exclude people based on race or class, that it's wrong to limit housing supply, which will push people further and further out to the perimeter of metropolitan areas and damage the environment as people have to take longer commutes. There are lots of different interests here that can come together to defeat the traditional NIMBY voices that have, for decades, really paralyzed the system. When I started researching this book back in 2017, there weren't a whole lot of examples I could point to of successful reform. And since then, we've seen quite a bit in blue states like California and Oregon, and in some red states like Montana and even Arkansas has seen some reforms. So I think there are ways to address those political barriers that have been so long enduring, but are beginning to show signs of weakness.
Yeah, there's definitely some soul searching going on in both sides of the political aisle. The conservative movement is trying to figure out, do we really believe in conservative economic ideas like deregulation, or do we kind of want to go all in on the culture war aspect of like Democrats are killing your suburbs kind of thing, where it's very much just a cultural and kind of class-based appeal. And liberals and Democrats are having to figure out, are we just kind of ideologically opposed to anything that sounds like deregulation? And we don't want developers to make a profit, even if it means that we're going to have a housing shortage, because there's some of that attitude on certain aspects of the left. But or do we just want to be the party of good governance? All big cities in America practically are run by Democrats. Are we going to be able to govern effectively and just build a lot of housing? You see a lot of this tension inside both parties, I think, where there's a sorting going on right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's on the right, there's the Trump demagogic argument that we can win votes if we support and defend the walls that keep Black people out of certain communities, low income people, and among Democrats there is a more highly ideological strain that is anti-deregulation and very distrustful of the idea that letting the market work can have a positive impact in this case. I mean, this is one of the rare instances that the New York Times editorial page has said where government is preventing builders from building homes where people want them. And that has all sorts of negative implications for equity and equal opportunity in America.
All right, so we're coming up on time now, and I want to ask the traditional final question that we always ask on this podcast. Where should people go to learn more if they are interested in what we've been talking about today? And I will start by saying you should check out the book Excluded by Richard Kahlenberg. That is what we're talking about today. That is obviously the first place you should go. The subtitle here is Excluded: How Snob Zoning, NIMBYism, and Class Bias Build the Walls We Don't See. So I will be happy to recommend the book. You should go check out Excluded. But other than your own book, is there anything you would recommend for people who just are interested in these ideas? And this could be different books you've read, different people to follow on Twitter, a YouTube channel, just like anything that you think would be a good resource for people.
Sure. Well, there's so many people from whom I learned in researching this book. I mean, Nolan Gray does a great job of going into the history of zoning and all the problems that are associated with it. Jenny Schutz at the Brookings Institution has written a book that goes to why we have our housing crisis, called Fixer Upper. Cheryl Cashin is a civil rights attorney and a law professor who does a great job of talking about the racial origins of our zoning problems. So there's no shortage of terrific books out there, all of which pointing to the case that we need to address exclusionary zoning. We need to make sure that markets can work. We need to make sure that opportunity is open to more people. And I'm excited that there really seems to be growing recognition of the problem. And I applaud, your organization, Jeremiah, and others that are part of the larger NIMBY movement to make sure that we see change in this country.
Well, from your lips to God's ears, hopefully, we can make some change happen on this issue. I told you before the call, before we started recording, that I tend to be a housing truther, that I think every problem we have in America, from slow economic growth to inequality to economic dynamism to, racial inequalities and the environment, and everything relates back to housing in some way. And so hopefully we can make some progress on this. I want to recommend the book one more time. It is Excluded by Richard Kahlenberg. Richard, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
So thanks so much, Jeremiah. I really enjoyed it.